Hello everyone, welcome back to the Cozy Corner. My name is Lee and this is my library. Grab a mug of something yummy and settle in for some talk of books. Today we are talking about what I read in September. So in comparison to most of the booktubers that I watch on BookTube, the amount of books I read this month is pitiful. Most of the booktubers who I watch read this many books within a couple weeks. And if anything, I was made more aware of the fact that I'm incredibly out of shape with, in many ways, but in particular with the amount of reading that I want to get done a month. That being said, September for me was a hard month. There were a lot of other things that were demanding my attention, but we got through 4 books, and I'm really excited because on the whole, most of them were really good. So let me walk you through quickly what my 1 to 5 star rating system looks like. Number 1, Readable. I got through it. Usually 1 or less, I will never recommend to anybody. Just because it's either not my cup of tea, I don't like the content, or it was badly written. Those books don't come along very often. 2 times I didn't finish a book. There was one in high school and I can't even remember the name of it now. But I was like 3 chapters in, and I was like, no, we're good, and I put it away. And apparently I've blocked it from my memory. The second was New Moon. Sorry, Stephanie Meyer, but it was not good. I got to the point in the book where every page, it was just the name of the month where Bella was missing Edward, and I'm like, all right, we're good, we're done. I closed the book, didn't read the rest of it. I did watch all the movies, however, which were all right. But never finished that series either. Number 2 is Enjoyable, or Easy Read. Kind of makes me go... A book where I read it, I wasn't really put off by anything. We got through it. It was an okay story. Easy reads, that's usually how I describe it. A book that I can pick up and read within a couple days and be like, yep, that was alright. Again, those usually pertain to books that I know are good, but also are not my cup of tea. Or they're not the type of thing that I would normally read, or it's not something that I know will impart to me a whole lot. So 2s also don't really happen very often. I'm expecting to maybe have a few more, given that my goal in completing my Read Everything on My Shelves challenge is to expand my taste in genre. But for now, I don't have too many 2s. 3 is the most average rating I get. It's right in the middle. It is a good book. It's a good book that you would enjoy reading. It captures your attention. You are invested in the story, and it's a good read. That's usually 3.5 is where I put a lot of my ratings for most things. 3 is good. It's a good read, and I would recommend it to anybody. 4 is highly recommend, where I will be shoving the recommendation down your throat. Usually those books are well liked, or will be well liked by a lot of people. They aren't niche or necessarily focused on a genre that I'm passionate about. They're just solid books that everybody needs to read. And then 5, the champagne tier is my personal favorite, and that is the ultimate rating that I could ever give a book, where it almost brings out that nerdy high school fanfiction writing girl. It is the type of book where it's the book that I won't shut up about. That's how I feel about Artemis Fowl, which is just it's my number 1. Despite the issues that I'm currently having with Owen Colfer and why he sold it to Disney. That's a can of worms we're not going to open today. So those are my rating systems from 1 to 5. Unfortunately, it's all 3.5 and lower today. Anyway, let's get into the reviews of these books. So, the first book I finished in September, I actually don't have with me because it is an ebook. It is The Missing Butterfly by Megan Derr. It is a gay romance novel, and I want to clarify, if there was any confusion, that is not the reason why I'm giving it half a star out of 5 stars. It has nothing to do with the fact that it's gay literature. It has everything to do with the fact that it's a bad book. So the plot of this story is there is a man whose name is Cassidy Monarch, who used to be a member of a rock and roll band. And after his parents die in a car crash, I think it was, he basically separates himself from the band, has to raise his 2 younger siblings, and basically is thrown at the age of 18 into a life of adult responsibility that he was not prepared for. Cut to years later when he meets Malcolm, who is the, I want to say, accounting manager, I think that's his title, of a record production, music management label. And of course, Malcolm and Cassidy fall in love. Took them a while, but they got there eventually, and it's basically just about their relationship, and there's some family drama, and will Cassidy end up back with his bandmates? Who knows? It's, I do because I read it. So this is an ebook, and there are a lot of stereotypes around ebooks. I have a hard time reading books that aren't edited well. And this one really felt like it needed an editor to take it under its wing, because I think it had a lot of potential storyline-wise, but it was let down by the excessive amount of smut. Ultimately, it reads like smutty fanfiction. I am not a fan of smut. I think, in my own personal opinion, that it is lazy writing and indicative of someone who is unable to capture the reader's attention with their regular writing. It's meant to shock and awe and distract from the fact that there's nothing of substance elsewhere. That's a harsh opinion to hold, and I know that I'm sure there will be people who disagree with me or think it a little too harsh that I would think that of other writers, but that's, out of all of the stuff that I have read, almost every time I have read something that is basically smut, or majority smut, I find that that's usually the case. I think it would have been more substantial and wholesome to gay literature had that storyline been fleshed out and given some wings and had more depth to it and was allowed to read like people living through hard times. Instead, that good plot that I think could have been there was shortchanged by the amount of smut and language that was in the book. It was ruined by cheap romance, which is sad. That, I think, is probably one of the things that pains me most about books like that, where it was such a good plot idea and could have been something so awesome, but they shortchanged it for the shock and awe of a sex scene. I will say, to Megan Derr's credit, that in the author introduction, or author summary at the end of the book, she did write in there that she's been accused before of writing fluff and nonsense. So I'm not, on the whole, trying to criticize her too much, because writing is an endeavor, and if you finish a story and you think it's done, then well done to you. You achieved something that most writers dream about. And if this is what she enjoys writing and it gives her fulfillment, then that's fine with me. It's just not what I like to read, and I wouldn't recommend it to anybody else. And this is also the reason why I've been learning to be a little bit more discerning with my Goodreads reviews, that when I find books, because that one had a plethora of 5-star reviews, and I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And then most of the reviews I read were just excerpts from the book, and it wasn't until I really started digging after I was halfway through that I realized, oh, actually, majority of the people didn't really get much from it. The Missing Butterfly by Megan Derr, 0.5 star out of 5 stars. And the second book that I finished in the month of September is Secrets of a Summer Night by Lisa Kleypas. It's an Edwardian era romance, think Downton Abbey era. This is the story of Annabelle Peyton. And Annabelle is a wallflower. She does not receive many suitors. Her family is rapidly becoming destitute, and she is craving an English aristocrat to save her family financially. She's also toying with the idea of becoming someone's mistress, because even then she'll still be provided for financially and she won't really have the burden of a marriage. So she's at this ball and she comes across 3 other girls who are also wallflowers, Two of them are sisters, and one is a shy girl who has a stutter. And during that ball, all four of them make a pact together to help one another get husbands, to remove them from the situations that they're in, and basically help their families. And so this is Annabelle's part of the story. There are three others in this series between the two sisters, Lillian and Daisy, and then Evangeline, who is the fourth girl. Basically, Annabelle stumbles across a man named Simon Hunt, who is a self-made man in the Edwardian era, who is a gajillionaire, who is both not welcome in his working class roots and also not welcome in the English aristocracy, who are notoriously uppity towards the self-made individual. But they sort of are dancing between, do they actually love each other? Will Annabelle become his mistress because Simon doesn't want to get married? Is she looking elsewhere? There's quite a few interesting not plot twists, but just interesting adds to the story that I think colored the romance a little bit better. It is a romance. So of course it ends in a particular relationship. I won't spoil it for you, but overall, I'm giving this one a 2 stars out of 5 stars. It's an easy read, enjoyable book. I didn't really have too much wrong with it, but it didn't really wow me either. I think what added an interesting insight to this book is because I have watched the entirety of Downton Abbey, and through that show learned about the struggles that the English aristocracy had with land maintenance that comes with titles and the pressure to maintain that land and keep the family in money. There's a lot of that in here, and Annabelle in particular is dealing with that because her family technically is a higher ranking family, but they're almost destitute, like I said, and there's several mentions of that from other characters, that it's becoming difficult to maintain land ownership, to keep on tenant farmers, and to keep the grandeur of the English aristocracy in full swing while the world is crying for the rise of the working class or self-made individuals. And so there's some of that conflict in here, and I think because I have watched the entirety of Downton Abbey, I found it more enjoyable, or it pulled me in a little more. This book also has some smut. While it's not my favorite, I did know that it did have some ahead of time, unlike The Missing Butterfly, which within the first couple chapters I was like, did not know that was this kind of book. I knew that this book had that in it because it was a airplane romance novel. I'm reminded of, in my public library, they used to have those rotating plastic racks of books that were mostly books like this, and I remember friends and I would be like, oh, those are the naughty adult books. Oh, that was a memory that just popped into my head. Anyway, I knew that there was some in here, and overall, it didn't really distract me too much from the story. It was uncomfortable, but I wasn't put off by it like I was with The Missing Butterfly. I honestly think that Chandler Bing's mom would be proud of this book. Overall, I liked the story, but it didn't really move me in any way. It was fairly predictable for the most part. There was a scene near the end about an accident in the locomotive foundry where Simon Hunt, he owns the foundry and also goes and helps and works there. That was something I didn't see coming, but it didn't really, like I said, move me in any way that would make me want to rate it anything higher than a 2. However, I am curious about the other 3 books because I liked several of the characters in the group of girls who are the Wallflowers, and so I'd be curious to... One in particular had a very interesting story that I am interested in reading again. That doesn't happen very often with 2s. I almost never want to read anymore. I don't have like the drive to read anymore like I would with some of my higher rated books, but I actually am incredibly interested in a couple of the other girls' stories. So maybe at some point I'll read more of them. I might check them out. I did buy this book off of Amazon. I don't know if I'll keep it or not. I may donate it. We'll see. So that was Secrets of a Summer Night. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. Gotta take a sip break. I apologize if the camera frame has been moving throughout this video. My tripod is currently at work, and the camera is sitting on a bunch of books on my uneven recliner. Oh dear. The third book that I finished in the month of September was The Wrath and the Dawn by Renee. Ahdieh. It is a YA fantasy novel. I actually haven't read a YA fantasy in a while. It's been a hot minute. So this was nice to get back to a familiar genre. This is the story of Shahrazad, who volunteers to become the wife of the boy king Khalid in the kingdom of Khorasan. And why it's such a big issue is the fact that for quite a while now, Khalid has been marrying young girls and then killing them the next morning. This follows Shahrazad's revenge plot, because up until this point no one has volunteered to marry Khalid, but Shahrazad's best friend Shiva married Khalid and was killed the next morning, and Shahrazad wants to exact her revenge. And then of course once she gets to the palace and meets Khalid and starts to learn more about him and why he's going through this process of killing a bunch of girls, she begins to fall in love with him and he with her. So it's their story of trying to deal with the pain of betrayal and murder and trauma, but also still developing feelings for one another. But there's a love triangle in here, some really good secondary characters that I really enjoyed. Magic. I have never read an Arabian Nights retelling, and while I don't think that's expressly what this is, it definitely has some Arabian Nights Aladdin influences. There's a magic carpet. Shahrazad is very similar to Scheherazade, who is the storyteller who 1001 Nights has 1001 stories to tell. She also does tell stories to Khalid, which is how, a little bit of a spoiler, she stays her execution. So there are some influences in there, but I don't think it's an express retelling. But if you like that kind of thing, that Aladdin-esque story, you would really like this one. Ultimately, I think one of my favorite parts of this book was Shahrazad. I really liked Shahrazad's character. She's an incredibly powerful woman. She's a little stubborn, but she is brave and doesn't take anything from anybody. I also really liked Despina, who is Shahrazad's handmaiden when she gets to the palace. And I liked Despina for pretty much the same reason. She didn't take any crap from Shahrazad, and she was assertive and opinionated and knew her own mind. And I just liked both of them. They were incredibly charismatic, and I don't think I've ever read characters quite like them. I enjoyed both of them very much. There were really two reasons why I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars. The first is that I think the reason for the premise came a little too late in the story to justify the intensity of the side stories that were happening. So the side stories that were happening were incredibly complex and intense, but because I didn't know why Khalid was murdering those girls and the internal conflict he was having, I don't think I got as much out of the side stories as I would have had I known both sides of the story, if that makes sense. So I wanted to feel the conflict as to why this was happening, why the murders of these girls were happening, and then also watch, while Khalid deals with that, the side stories of people wanting to take revenge. I hope I explained that well enough. I guess there is a style of writing where, you know, the reader is kept at a limited view, so they experience the story real time with the main character, which is fine, and I think that's an excellent style of writing, and I like those books. But the problem is, so much was happening outside that was so intense and reactionary that I wanted to know why faster so that I could fully appreciate the actual conflict that was happening. And then the second reason is that there is magic in here, but the explanation of its existence and how it functions in this world was lacking. So, like I said, there was a magic carpet. Shahrazad ends up having magic. There's a mage who comes and visits the palace. Her father has magic, and none of that was really explained as to how it exists or how it functions in this universe. And I think that was part of the reason why I didn't really connect with the fact that there was magic. I mean, I would expect something like it with Arabian Nights and Aladdin. Even the genie in Aladdin explained like the parameters of his magic, but there was none of that in here. I think this book needs a sequel, and I'm glad that she's written one. However, I'm not really craving reading it because, I don't know, it left me a little bit dissatisfied, but it didn't pull me in enough to say, oh, I want to go find the sequel and read it. Maybe I'll read it eventually, but I don't think I'm that interested in the story to finish it. She does have a bunch of novellas that beef up the storyline and give other perspectives to this story in her sequel, which I think is interesting. Yeah, it didn't capture my attention enough to actively seek out the sequel. Maybe I'll read it eventually. I have a lot of questions about this universe. I mentioned in my vlog that's coming out soon that this is a book that I have seen a lot of other booktubers review. And I have not watched any of their reviews of this book until I had read it and formulated my own opinion on it, because that's what I really like to do. I don't like to read things at the height of when they're popular because I want to formulate my own opinions and not be swayed by the masses, if you will. So now that I've kind of, I think, firmly made my decision as to why I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, I'm going to go read and watch some other people's reviews of this book and see if they can maybe change my mind and maybe inspire a little more appreciation for it. But like I said, 3 is a good book, so I think a lot of people will enjoy this, and it's a good YA fantasy. It's a good concept. I think I've just read enough of YA fantasy to be able to pick holes where I don't think anybody else would maybe care or mind. That's just my own 2 cents. And the final book I read in the month of September is this boy, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. The relief I felt when I finally finished, and I'm so happy to have finally checked this off my classics to read list. It's so good. I ended up giving it 3.5 out of 5 stars, so right in the middle of it's really good and I would highly recommend. Right smack dab in the middle. I think most of the classics I read, with the exception of a few, are that way, where, again, it's almost the hype of the book almost lets it down a little bit. It is obviously a classic, but it's also, I think I would probably categorize it under 2 other things of adventure and revenge, because there's both of those elements in here. The Count of Monte Cristo is the story of Edmond Dantes, who is a very skilled young sailor who arrives back at Marseille, France, to discover that there has been a plot to basically bring his downfall. He's poised to marry the love of his life, he's poised to inherit a ship, and is well loved by a lot of people, but there are people in his company who despise him or are envious of his position or status, or who are in love with the girl he loves, and they basically plot together one drunken evening to bring about his downfall. And he is accused of being a Bonapartist, which basically means a supporter of of Napoleon Bonaparte, when there's been a resurgence of royalist support in France. So he's basically accused of being a traitor and is thrown in prison. While there, he discovers a fortune awaits hidden on an island, and he escapes prison and gets the treasure, waits several years, transforms himself into the persona of Monte Cristo, and then wreaks havoc on the lives of the people who betrayed him. This book I spent a lot of time waiting to finish. I picked it up in the summer of 2015, maybe made it about 200 pages through, and then put it down. Not because I didn't want to finish it, I intended to finish it. I just never got around to doing it, and then it got put back on my shelf and I forgot about it. Now I have finally finished it 5 years later, and it was good. So something that's interesting about this book is the balance of the climax, of where the climax hits in the story. So about here, this is about 150 pages to roughly 500 over here. This, in between this break, is where the climax of the story happens. This 100 pages is jam-packed with Dante's story of him being arrested and in prison and eventually escaping. And the rest is just the fall of all the people who wronged him right up until the end. And it's such a weird balance that the climax is so close to the beginning of the story that it was almost a little challenging to read because you were just watching dominoes fall. But it still kept you on the edge of your seat because you wanted to know what happened. I have never read a book that's quite like that, where the climax happens so early in the story, and then you're just left to reap the after effects of what happens. If you have any books that are like that, where the climax happens very quickly and the rest is almost reactionary, then I would really love to know your recommendations, because I kind of want to read more like this. It surprised me how much I liked reading a book that was written that way. Another thing that helped me enjoy Monte Cristo more were the introduction and notes, which were written by Luc Santi, who basically compiled all the information that went into this edition of Monte Cristo. It gave such insight. I geeked out about it in my first weekly reading vlog. It gave such insight into who Dumas, the author, was, and his own personal struggles and issues, and how much of a charlatan he was almost with his writing and what he got away with in his writing career. But also that this book was really the first instance where his own personal tragedies and traumas seeped into his writing, which, you know, usually is the number one rule of writing. You write about what you know. And up until this point, he didn't really. But this is the first instance where you sort of get to peek at the man behind the curtain and understand his struggle with money and his dispassion towards relationships and the absence of a father figure and growing up without one. I don't know if I would have enjoyed this story as much had I not read that ahead of time. And then also the endnotes that Luc Santi provided, which gives glimpse into the actual long edition. This is the abridged edition. This is 600 roughly pages out of the 1,000 that this book is actually consists of. And the endnotes really helped fill in any gaps. Not that there were too many, but it helped supplement, saying you don't really need this to get the full impact of the story, and I think he was right. This book also has quite a few side stories. Several of them have been cut out of the abridged edition. There were only really a few instances where something happened in the story. I'm like, oh, something happened in a side story that is mentioned here that I didn't read about, but it wasn't integral to the main part of the story. But there are quite a few side stories in here, not just the story of Monte Cristo. And for a time, you almost get bogged down with the amount of characters in the story and what they do and how they're related to one another. It's kind of War and Peace-esque with how many people are in this book. So for a while, until I got the hang of it, I had to keep a list of names, the family, what they did to Monte Cristo, because there are quite a few side stories in here. And if I wasn't careful, I would read like 4 pages and be like, I have no idea who's talking or what's happening. But once I got the hang of it after the first 10-ish chapters, then it became much easier. I think another interesting part of this book is the fact that after the first 150 pages, Monte Cristo arrives and begins to move things along in terms of his revenge plot, but then he really takes a back seat to the secondary characters in the story, and you only really see him like whack-a-mole pop up in the plot line when it's most convenient for him. He almost is a reactionary character at that point, where a problem occurs in the secondary character's life, which he caused, and they go to Monte Cristo asking for his help, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh, here's how I'll help you. But he really does take a back seat to everybody else, and I think that's so interesting that the main character is almost invisible to the reader, as you're just sort of swept up in the awful things that happen to everybody who wronged him. And the ending was interesting. It was the last couple chapters were furious and very dark, and there's a little bit of insanity there, so it was very harsh. But then in the last chapter, all of a sudden it did a 180, and it was actually incredibly wholesome. the ending. I want to read to you the quote that stuck out to me from the entirety of the book, which was in the last chapter. And this is Edmond Dante, who's the Count of Monte Cristo. This is him speaking. He says, "Never forget that until the day comes when God will deign to reveal the future to man, all human wisdom is contained in these words: wait and hope." I thought that was so beautiful and such an interesting note to end on after all of the bizarre stuff that happened in this book. So I gave this one 3.5 out of 5 stars. I'm incredibly glad that I finally finished it and can check it off my to-read list. And we can move on to something else. So those were the 4 books in my What I Read in September. And if you have read any of these and would like to share your opinions or thoughts on them, please share them with me. I would love to know and have a conversation with you about them. Also, if you have any fall reads that you think I should read, drop them in the comments. I'm always looking for new book recommendations. And now that we've finished those 4, we have a new month. I've got 2 new books going right now, and I'm excited to see what we're going to read next. If you would like and subscribe, I would appreciate it. It helps me know what to keep doing. Thank you for coming back to the Cozy Corner and for being a part of my library. A huge thank you to the friends and family who have readily supported me on this journey. I can't wait to see what's on the next page. Cheers.